Hello, Manchester, and welcome to another edition of Girard at Large. I am still your tanned, rested, and ready host, Rich Girard. Thanks for tuning in. Yes, I've gotten multiple comments on my tan. Where'd you get that, they asked. I said, well, an awful lot of door knocking. That and traveling to the polls on Tuesday, the 21st, which is now about a week and a half in the rear view mirror. And tomorrow, Friday, the 1st of October. Oh my, September is already gone. How about that? Tomorrow, the 1st of October, will be the recount. It starts at 9 o'clock in the morning. The city clerk's office anticipates it will take between 5 and 6 hours to get through the counting. So we should know by, I'd say, mid to late afternoon on Friday whether or not the 128 votes that separates myself from Victoria Sullivan changes, and if so, how. Now, I have gotten a lot of, let's just say there's been a lot of conversation about the recount. And there are people who, first of all, the vast majority of people anyway who've supported me in the election want to see the recount. And if nothing else, I owe the folks who supported me and worked as hard as so many of them did, a recount. I mean, it was about a percentage point difference between the two of us. And while that seems like a small margin to some and a bigger margin to others, there are some facts that everybody should know that really sort of went into the decision to have a recount. The first is that there were approximately 900 absentee ballots cast. Now, if let me back up. The first is really what happened in Windham. And if you're not sure what happened in Windham this past 2020 general election, there was a recount there where Democrat Christy St. Laurent, who ran for state rep, lost by 23 votes. Windham's got 4 state reps. And so the recount took place. And what they found was in the recount, Mrs. St. Laurent lost 99 votes. And all 4 of her Republican opponents gained about 300. It was 299, 301, 302, 300. They were all bunched right in there. And that was a real eye-opener for people. It caused legislation to be passed unanimously through the general court to authorize an audit of what took place in Windham. And I know people who were intimately involved in that process of getting the legislation passed and of monitoring the audit. Though I have not read the audit report myself, they came to a conclusion that the creases in the absentee ballots, the mail-in ballots, threw the machines off. And, the story changed from, they fed all of the ballots into one voting machine versus feeding them into multiple machines and a whole bunch of other stuff. Long story short, they blamed the creases in the ballots for confusing the machine and somehow causing that to give Mrs. St. Laurent 99 more votes than she really got. And all of the Republicans roughly 300 fewer votes than they really got, which is kind of goofy if you think about it, because the creases in the ballot are horizontal, but the listing on the ballot are vertical. So call me a dope, but I don't understand how something that goes this way affects something that goes that way and deprives all 4 Republican candidates of 300 votes while giving 100 votes to the Democrat. But I digress. So what happened in Windham is really sort of the issue. And given what they claim as the reason, I think it's fair game for us to see whether or not there was any sort of problem with the machines in Manchester reading the absentee ballots here in the Queen City, especially since my name was at the top of the ballot, and if there was a crease, very likely was going to be creased. So that's number one. Number two, there were 900 or so absentee ballots cast, so it was almost 10% of the overall total, which is not an insignificant number. And then third, there were 116 ballots that didn't record any vote for mayor. So when you take into account those 3 things and a 128 vote margin, it's perfectly defensible to ask for a recount. And that's what we're going to do. And as far as I'm concerned, the worst case scenario for us is simply that the count will be verified and we can have greater confidence in the machines than, frankly, a lot of people in the city and across the state have in these machines at the moment, given what happened in the 2020 election in Windham, and with all of the, the allegations of voter fraud, many of which are real, by the way. How does Detroit have 148% turnout? How are there wards in Milwaukee where more people voted than actually live in the ward? That kind of stuff. Yeah. So how can Georgia have lost chain of custody on over 400,000 mail-in ballots? How could Pennsylvania have 600,000 more mail-in ballots counted than they physically mailed out to people to cast? So there are, I think, well-founded reasons for people to be concerned about election integrity. And if nothing else, this recount, if it verifies the result, is going to hopefully put people at ease about the machines that we use to count ballots here in Manchester and in 85% of the communities across the state of New Hampshire. So there's that. And not for nothing, what typically happens in a recount is a whole lot of votes. I say a whole lot, relatively speaking, but typically the vote counts for all parties will go up because ballots that were not read, were incorrectly marked. A lot of this happens with absentees, which tend to be cast by, largely elderly folks who maybe didn't darken in the circle enough, who maybe used a check mark instead of filling it in, whatever the case may be. So typically what happens is you see a lot of folks, you see vote totals go up. The question is, does one go up by enough to overcome the other? And we are going to find that out tomorrow. Now, folks in the Sullivan camp are not happy with me for filing this recount. Word on the street is my doing this is, quote, harming their fundraising ability and casting doubt about the election. Well, casting doubt about the election, I think, is a bit of a stretch given how these things typically go. But as I told somebody who brought this to my attention, asking me to, withdraw the recount request, I simply said, look, if the shoe were on the other foot, and if I had won by 128 votes, they'd be recounting too. And that's fine. I wouldn't begrudge them that. But if it were going to be a problem fundraising, as they claim, I would simply tell any potential donor, look, this is what I expect is going to happen. This is why I expect it's going to happen. And if the outcome changes, anything you donate to my campaign, I will turn around and cut a check directly to the Sullivan campaign, so that those monies get to the Republican candidate in this race. So I'm not buying their complaint that I'm hobbling their fundraising, and they would do well, I think, to just focus on what they need to do instead of continuing to blame me for all of their campaign problems. I was the reason why they couldn't fundraise in the primary, and the laundry list of complaints went from there. But so the recount is tomorrow. And I want to thank everybody from my team who has volunteered to be there. We're looking to have a pretty good crew there tomorrow. So hopefully things will move smoothly, and we'll get some insight into what happened in this election. So last week we talked about the numbers, and I still do not have from the city clerk's office, because they have not yet completed. They have to scan in the checklist to the state system before they can pull out the numbers of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats that turned out to vote. That has not been completed yet, and hopefully it will be completed by the time I see you next week, so we can do a little deeper analysis on the numbers. But that didn't stop me from taking a look at the election results and comparing them to past election results. And I want to thank I want to thank Lori in particular, who asked me some questions that got me to dig a little deeper. If we take a look at how the primary went, we'll see a few things. And I'm going to do this from the perspective of Joyce Craig, the incumbent, because I think the numbers, my gut is, are going to bear out that while Republican turnout certainly was higher than it was in the prior primary, Democrat turnout was higher as well. We still don't have an answer to the question of whether or not the Democrat turnout was better than, equal to, or worse than the improvement in Joyce's numbers. Now, percentage-wise, last primary she got 56.5%. This primary she got 52. So percentage-wise, she slipped back, but in absolute votes, she actually went up just a shade under 10%. So again, the turnout numbers are going to tell us a whole lot more about what these numbers mean. But her best ward percentage-wise was Ward 1, where she got 63% of the vote in this past primary. Then it went to Ward 3, because she picked up 61% of the vote in Ward 3. She picked up 58% of the vote in Ward 2. Then she picked up 53% of the vote in Ward 4, 52% of the vote in Ward 7, and let me see. She picked up 50% of the vote in Ward 6 and 50% of the vote in Ward 10. Then from there, she picked up 47% of the vote in Ward 9. 47% of the vote in Ward 6, 45% of the vote in Ward 5. Interesting that a heavy Democrat ward like that is one of her worst wards. Then it went to Ward 8 with 43% of the vote, and her worst ward was Ward 11 with 41% of the vote. So when we take a look at that, any ward where she did not get 50% is a ward that potentially is going to swing against her in the general election. The trouble with that rough analysis is that we need to take a look at the 2019 general election to see what percentages she got in that election, because the vote count between the primary and the general in 2019 went up by a little more than double. Okay, so we can project this out and think that you're going to see probably around 21,000 voters, I think, in the general election this fall. And that will be driven largely by, again, who's turning out to vote. Republicans and Republican-leaning independents tend to turn out in higher numbers in the general election than they do in the primary. The question is, will it be enough to overcome the margin that she is going to have with Democrat turnout turning up? So in the 2019 general election, percentage-wise, her best ward was actually Ward 3, where she gets 64% of the vote. Then it went to Ward 1 with 63% of the vote, and Ward 2 with 61% of the vote. Then it was Ward 5 with 59%. So the turnout percentage-wise really jumped for Democrats in Ward 5 in the general. Then it went to Ward 4 with 58% of the vote. Then it went to Ward 12 with 56% of the vote. And again, this is for Joyce Craig. Ward 10 with 55, Ward 7 with 53, Ward 6 with 52. Where's number 10? Ward 11 with 52. So the numbers for her came up in Ward 11. Ward 9 with 51, and then she lost Ward 12, getting 49% of the vote, where she overall got 56% of the vote in the general election. So while there do appear to be some soft spots where she may be vulnerable, the wards where those spots are soft are Ward 11, which is a solidly Democratic ward, Ward 9, which is also a Democratic ward, Ward 8, which is a Republican ward, which she'll probably lose again, Ward 6, which in state elections tends to vote Republican, but in local elections tends to be more Democratic, but still nonetheless is a more Republican ward than most. Ward 5, which is a solidly Democratic ward. So a lot of the wards that underperformed in the primary for Joyce are Democratic wards that are likely to see higher Democrat turnout in the general election. So I know there is an attempt by the Sullivan campaign to try to repaint this as 2005, the year that Ginta beat Baines and came from behind. I think honestly, that analysis is off. The city 16 years later is a whole lot different than it was back then. Ginta only lost Ward 1 by 400 votes. Actually, I think he might have tied her there, tied Baines there. But, certainly Ward 1, Ward 2, Ward 3 have trended far more Democratic than they were back in 2005. And while Republicans have made gains in places like Ward 8 and Ward 6, the numbers coming out of those wards for Republicans don't offset, those big Democrat margins. So, not to begrudge, not to beat this horse again, but Victoria Sullivan is no Frank Ginta, who had a couple terms under his belt as an alderman and was a credible threat on city issues because of his time as an alderman, in addition to having been a state rep. So she does not have that command of the issues or that credibility on a city level that Frank did. And Frank also had a whole lot of personal money that he could put into the race, which he did. And I think that helped turn the tide. So the numbers analysis at this point is one that is well, it shows some opportunities. The question is whether or not they can be capitalized on, and only time will tell on that. So. I want to go from there to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. They flinched, I guess would be the best way to put it, on putting the questions to the voters as to whether or not the charter should be changed to remove the mayor from the school board and to, in their weasel words, give the school board fiscal or financial, I forget which, autonomy. They don't come out and say that the questions don't come out and say the mayor will be removed from the school board. The question says, the school board shall vote for its chairman. You don't say, that could mean anything, right? Because the mayor by charter is the ex officio chairman, but nonetheless a member of the school board. So that could imply that the mayor is still going to be on the school board, but instead of automatically being the chairman, would have to be elected to be chairman, right? And then there's this whole fiscal autonomy thing. What the question doesn't say, or what the question didn't say or imply in any way, is that the school board would have the ability to not only appropriate its own budget, but send you, the taxpayers of the city of Manchester, a separate tax bill. And I love the weasel words that were put into the charter and how put into the charter question and how people defended it. Oh, well, it's still going to be subject to the tax cap, so the taxpayers don't need to worry. Well, if the budget is still going to be subject to the tax cap, what is the point of removing the school board from underneath the Board of Mayor and Aldermen for the purposes of appropriating a budget and sending a tax bill? For people to argue that this is what the schools need right now to provide for our students is to implicitly say that the school board will, in a heartbeat, override the tax cap to do what is best for our students. Otherwise, tell me, if the tax cap is still going to rule the day, what is the point of removing the schools from the city budget process? What is the point of creating a separate budget process just for the schools, if not to overcome, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen and its refusal to override the tax cap to give more money to the schools? If you were the police department, wouldn't you love the ability to set your own budget and send your own tax bill, or the fire department or the public works department? Can you think of a department that wouldn't want the ability for the good of our roads, for the good of our safety, for the good of our fire protection, for the good of our emergency services, for the good of the fill in the blank? Can you think of a department? Can you think of a commission? Can you think of anybody in the city that wouldn't want the opportunity to, without the approval of the governing body, set its own budget and send you a tax bill? No, of course not. All of them, given the opportunity, would jump at that. They'd be all over it like white on rice, right? So why should the schools be any different? Why are the schools going to be any better off with their own budget authority than they would be under the aldermen if they're subject to the same tax cap that the rest of the city budget is subject to? Right. So the schools, like any other department, should have to come forward and make its case to the appropriating body, the governing body, which is the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. So despite the mayor's continued support for that, it failed. And it failed for a couple reasons. One, Barbara Shaw, who initially voted to put the question on the ballot, changed her mind. Apparently, she has seen enough and heard enough, especially in light of the revaluation where residential taxpayers across the city have been hammered by the shift in value from commercial industrial to residential. And she thinks the timing is wrong. Well, she may be very right about that. And newly minted Ward 8 Alderman Ed Sapienza filled the void that existed the last time there was a vote, and he voted no after saying in the newspaper he was going to vote yes. Apparently, according to the comments I saw him make at that special meeting of the board, he heard in spades from his ward that they did not want that on the ballot. And while he believes, as I do, it would be defeated if it were on the ballot, he thinks it's too risky right now with everything going on, and his folks don't want it. So the measure went down 7-5 with Tony Sapienza from Ward 5 absent, and there was another alderman who was absent. Who was absent? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, by the way, Jim Roy, you were brilliant. After Bill Berry said, "Oh well, we put the tax cap on the ballot and we let the voters speak. We should trust them enough to speak on this." Jim Roy was Johnny on the spot and right to remind everybody that no, the aldermen did not vote to put that on the ballot. In fact, if you remember correctly, Mayor Ginta held them there till like midnight on the last day trying to get them to vote to put it on the ballot, which they refused to do. And so it was passed by a citizen's petition. So citizens of the city of Manchester, led by Jeff Cassell, who ran for mayor in that same election with Ginta in 2005, collected the signatures that were necessary to put it on the ballot. And so it went to you, the voters. And, I kind of would have liked to see it on the ballot. So guys like Ron Ludwig, the former Ward 2 alderman, who said it was just a few thousand voters on a rainy Tuesday who didn't know what they were doing, who put the city in that straitjacket of the tax cap. I would like to have seen it come out. Now, word that I'm getting is the reason why, the Republican aldermen in particular voted against it was the Sullivan campaign didn't want it on the ballot. They were worried that the Democrats who want to give the schools spending and taxing authority would turn out in greater numbers. And I think their analysis there is correct to a degree, but how many more votes are you going to get out of, wards 1 and 2 that you aren't already going to get? I don't see there being a whole lot of people who don't normally vote in a city election coming out to vote to give the schools the ability to spend and tax on their own. However, I do, for whatever increase in turnout there would have been for that, I do think there would have been a much greater turnout of people who are like, oh, hell no, we're not giving the school board the authority to spend and tax on its own to come out and vote. And I think evidence of that was clear in the primary, where a routine question that, to my knowledge, has never failed to pass, asking the citizens of Manchester whether or not they want to form a charter commission, which this question comes up every 10 years. Would you like to form a charter commission to review and potentially amend or revise the city charter? It not only went down, it went down in flames. In fact, I think over in Rockrimmon Park somewhere, there are still smoldering embers of that question. It got crushed. It wasn't even close. And the reason for that was people who turned out to vote were like, oh, hell no, I don't want to do anything with the charter. And I think the tactics, the political tactics, erred. I think Joyce Craig dodged a major bullet when that question was killed by the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. I don't disagree with the reasoning that Alderman Sapienza, Ward 8, or Alderman Sharonov, Ward 6, or Alderman Roy in Ward 4, who spoke out against the question. The questions were deceiving. They were, weasel worded. They did not provide clarity as to what would happen if the question passed. Now, the general rule of thumb again is if people are confused or they're not sure, they typically vote no. The trouble, as I brought out when I testified on the questions originally, was that they were designed to deceive because they mixed in things where people say, oh, well, that just makes sense. Like the school board gets to apportion its own budget. Yeah, it does that now, right? The Board of Aldermen gives the school board money, and there it ends for the Board of Aldermen. The schools have complete and total control over what they do with the money given to them by the Board of Aldermen. It should have its own treasurer and its own clerk. Well, we already have that. Should have its own auditor. We already have that. So there was a bunch of stuff that was in the question that that came up that the schools already do. They already have. And the rest of it was, well, they should have fiscal autonomy over their own budget. Well, of course they should have autonomy over their own budget. But having autonomy over your own budget in the minds of most people isn't going to be, oh, yeah, they have the right to raise and spend as much as they want and send you a tax bill. Yeah. Oh, but they did manage to sneak in that it would be subject to the tax cap. So, can you think of 5 people on that school board now who wouldn't vote to override the tax cap? I can think of Joe LaChance, and I think he's about the only one who wouldn't vote to override the tax cap. So you know what's going to happen if that question goes to ballot. And so my theory, however, is now if I personally would have rather have it on the ballot because the marketing on that is pretty simple, even though the question sucks. And I think that would have done an awful lot to pull even more, we'll call them anti-tax voters, out of their chairs. Now, remember, it wasn't all that long ago. It was in the last term, as a matter of fact, where Alderman Tim Baines tried to put the tax cap on the ballot. A referendum, more or less, shall we keep the tax cap? And Gene Martin, who was then the chairman of the City Democratic Party, was making phone calls to Democratic aldermen, I know, because a couple of them told me, strong-arming the Democrats and demanding they vote no because it would, quote, pull the wrong voters to the polls. They thought it presented a danger to Joyce Craig's reelection because it would draw more fiscally conservative anti-tax voters to the polls to defend the tax cap. So in the 2019 election, the aldermen, they sandbagged Baines's amendment or Baines's question from going on to the ballot because it would be bad for the Democrats. I think it would have had the same effect had these school charter amendments been put on the ballot. I think it would have drawn a whole lot of people out. And I think the Sullivan campaign's calculation that it was too risky and it would cause more liberal voters to who don't normally vote to vote. I don't see that. And so I would have had a different tactical opinion. So the dogs got called off there. Because the Sullivan campaign did not want that on the ballot, which, okay, that's their call. But there it is. Speaking of calls, 640-3091. That's 640-3091. Tomorrow is Friday, October 1st, and that is the day the city school district has to file its enrollment numbers with the state. Now, I gather there was some discussion about enrollment at the school board meeting this past Monday. I did not see it. I have not looked at the agenda, so I don't know what the school numbers look like. I do recall Dr. Goldhart at some point in the recent future saying that the numbers of homeschooled children were way up this year over last year, which was way up over the prior year. And he has, quote, concerns about that. I don't know why he would have concerns about that, except every kid being homeschooled is a kid that is not, going to the Manchester School District and therefore not going to put money into the school district's coffers from the state. But I'll tell you, and I had this discussion with Dr. Vargas when I was on the school board and he was the superintendent. And I said, look, it's really simple. Having homeschooled my kids for 2-3 years, depending on the kid, I know, for example, when they were in middle school, there were classes that my daughters wanted to take at Hillside. And so they did. The school district got paid part of the state aid that it would have gotten for the kids if they had been there full time because they took classes from the school. So if you're a school district and you see a giant move towards homeschooling, that's your parents saying, we don't like you anymore. So we're going to take matters into our own hands. But B, not all homeschooling parents can provide all sort of academic experiences to their kids. And yes, there are homeschooling groups and things that help with that. But if I'm the school district and I want to do something about that, maybe even start a way of recapturing them, I send something to the parents and say, congratulations on homeschooling your children or child. We respect and appreciate your decision to do that. We would like you to know, however, that the Manchester School District remains available to you to provide maybe specialty classes that you might not be able to teach at home. Could be an art class, could be a chorus class, could be a computer class. Maybe the parent has trouble in math, whatever the case may be, and invite parents to take a look at the offerings that the school they would otherwise send their kid to would as a way of maybe getting some of these parents to enroll in a class or two and then capturing some of the state aid for that and creating that connection or maintaining that connection between the students and the staff. I can tell you one thing. I don't know too many parents who sent their kids to Catholic school last year because the Manchester School District shut down rather than open up. I don't know one that's sending their kids back to the public schools. I don't know one parent who's sent their kids to a charter school that is now saying, oh, thank God we can send our kids back to the Manchester School District who's doing that. So I expect we're going to see numbers that, if they've improved, have only improved because parents who didn't send their kids to kindergarten last year, because kindergarten remains an optional grade, sent their kids to first grade this year, and kindergarten will be repopulated this year. So if we're seeing any recovery in any of the numbers, it'll probably be in those lower grades. But October 1st is the date by which the schools have got to report their full and final census numbers to the state, student census numbers to the state for the purposes of state aid for the following year. And so we'll be looking for those numbers, and hopefully we'll get them to you next week as well. We have Barbara on the phone. Barbara, thanks for calling in. Barbara, you're on the air.
Hey, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome. Thank you for calling.
When I worked in broadcasting some time ago, I was told that if you're in a position to ask somebody a pointed question, go ahead and do it. So here I am. I'm looking at Ray Wieczorek, and he in the primary endorsed your opponent for mayor. He served the city for almost 10 years as mayor. He served on the executive council until 2012. He was commissioner of the Manchester Housing and Development Authority. He was defeated by Bob Baines in 1999, but he served the city for quite some time. I think one of the things that disappointed me was he opened up Manchester to a welcoming city, which is, I think, has caused us some problems in that we haven't been able to absorb or assimilate
right, the refugees.
A lot of the people that have come here. But I know you served during his administration, and I'm just listening to you tonight, and the numbers and the number crunching that you have done, and to be in an advisory position. During the time that he was mayor, I gave birth to 4 or 5 children, so I wasn't following politics quite as closely as I probably could have been. But I'm concerned right now with some of the crap, and there's a lot of crap on social media, but some of the crap. I'd like you to please address your position in his administration, and were you ever so dissatisfied that you kind of started helping the Baines administration, or you turned your back on it, or were you just trying to be honest about what the numbers were saying? I get so discouraged, and this last voter turnout, I think, shows the apathy, and I understand some of it, but I don't see you as a person who would deliberately sabotage
are you
somebody's administration, and I'd like to go to the horse's mouth and ask you the question. So here I am.
So you must have seen all of that stuff put up by Tammy Simmons and Victoria Sullivan, among others, accusing me of betraying Ray Wieczorek and feeding Bob Baines inside information while I worked for him.
Yeah, I can understand how people might think that, but I think I think you have to have an opportunity to address that, and so since you have a program and I can call in, I'd like to ask you about it.
All right. Well, Barbara, I appreciate the call, and I will endeavor to answer. Thank you. Yeah. Well, a lot of what was published on social media about my alleged betrayal of Ray Wieczorek was not only wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of it, I think, came from Ray. And I'm going to start, for those of you who don't know, give you a little background. I worked for Ray right out of college. I managed his first reelection campaign, and I worked in his office from January of 1992 to August of 1997. When I resigned my seat as his aide amidst a power play between him and the aldermen. In that budget, that last budget that I worked on for Ray, he had wanted to increase the number of staff he had from 2 to 3 so he could dedicate a staff person to the schools. The aldermen weren't a fan of that, and they not only removed that, but they removed one of the 2 existing positions, and the idea was they wanted to, quote, get rid of me. I allegedly didn't play nice in the sandbox and couldn't work with people, et cetera, et cetera. This would be the guy who, in the 3 budgets he organized for Ray Wieczorek, never got fewer than 19 of the 23 departments, agreeing with the numbers that the mayor wanted to present. And as the director of legislative affairs, completely revamped how the city tracked legislation and how the city was represented either by the mayor's office or a department on any matter pending before the city. And both processes that I was in charge of there were extremely cooperative between myself and the departments. Now, it's true from time to time I did clash with various aldermen. And Mayor Wieczorek had an agenda that certainly Bill Cashin and the Democrats did not stand in favor of. And I often was the guy who got sent to committees or other places to say the things that the mayor did not want to say in environments that he did not want to say them in. And sometimes there were contests. And there were also contests between Ray and certain Republican aldermen. David Wibby comes to mind when Jackie Domain was an alderman, for the fact that Ray and Jackie were often on the same page. At times they weren't. And, well, there were some challenges there. Anyway, My trouble really in that office began with an argument I had with Keith Hirschman during that last budget that I worked on. And Keith came to the office one day and he wanted me to disclose certain information about the budget. And I told him I couldn't do that. The mayor had told me, zip, no leaks, no discussion. If anybody wanted to know about the budget, they had to talk to him. I relayed that to Alderman Hirschman, who did not take it very kindly. And the situation sort of devolved or declined to him saying, look, you work for me. Tell me what I want to know. And I said, no. I said, when your name is on the front of my paycheck, I work for you. Until then, I work for Mayor Wieczorek. And if you want to know what's in the budget, you need to have a meeting with him. That set off a series of events that led Cashin and Wibby and others who had long wanted to see me gone because of my effective advocacy for Ray Wieczorek. That gave them the votes to do it. So rather than, and not for nothing, I would not have been the aide that would have lost their job. It would have been Sean Thomas, the other aide in the office. The mayor, if he was going to lose a position, wasn't going to let the alderman determine which person got tossed. So my job was never really threatened. But I, at that point, I had been in that office for almost 6 years. The bloom was off the rose, so to speak, and I was kind of happy to move on. So I went to Ray and I said, I will offer my resignation in exchange for them putting the money back in the budget. And I told him at that point in time I was going to run for alderman at large, which was a position that was newly created under the charter that had just passed in the prior election. And that's exactly what I did. And I led the ticket in both the primary and the general and won the election. People may recall, if they were around that long, that one would have thought that the mayor and I would have gotten along better as mayor and alderman than we actually did. And I would come to find out several years later from someone who was in the room that the mayor actually was given an ultimatum by then chairman of the board, David Wibby, to sort of put me in the corner. And if he kind of ostracized or marginalized me on the board and played with Wibby and his gang, they would get him all the votes he needed for the, for whatever he wanted to do. But if they were, if he was seen playing ball with me, he'd get nothing. And I didn't know it at the time, but, I knew something was wrong because people kept asking me during my term as alderman why we weren't getting along. And come to find out, and I wouldn't find this out until, I don't know, probably 2004, 2005, somewhere in there in a conversation that I had with someone who was a witness to what took place in that meeting. And then a whole lot of things made sense. Now, when I ran for mayor in 2001, Ray did not support me in the primary. In fact, well, he didn't do it publicly. He supported Joe Levasseur, and there was a picture of him at Levasseur's campaign headquarters, which was his restaurant at the time, going over the election returns. So he went to Levasseur's on election night, did not come to mine. Whatever differences we had or hard feelings we may have had over our term and some other stuff that took place. Seriously, when we were both running for office in 1997, his campaign staff and ultimately him accused me of stealing volunteers from their campaign, which was really sort of weird since it was, my volunteers were really all my family and friends. But that notwithstanding, we had, my campaign had dropped literally 2/3 of the city by the time this accusation was made. And, their teams that were supposed to lit drop stuff for us didn't lit drop anywhere. So we ended up having to go into neighborhoods twice. Ray and I did not have a very pleasant meeting over that because I was just stunned at the accusation and people giving me a hard time, despite all the work that was being done. Long story short, Ray decides, okay, the primary's over. He's going to support me in the general election for mayor, which was great. I was obviously happy about that. And then shortly after that came out, there was an article in the newspaper planted by the Baines campaign, where Baines and Brad Cook, his campaign chairman, said that I had a meeting with Bob during the 1999 campaign where Baines defeated Wieczorek. And I got a phone call from Ray, and he said, "Did you meet with him?" I said, "Yeah, I met with him." So he's like, "Well, why did you meet with him?" He said, I told him, I said he had questions about my budget proposals and my consolidation proposals. "That's all you talked about?" I said, "Yeah." And obviously he didn't pay attention, because what he did during his 2 years as mayor certainly didn't, no advice from me. And he said, "Well, you shouldn't have talked to him." I said, "Well, I did. There's nothing I can do about it." And at that point, he withdrew his support from the campaign, and he did an awful lot of damage to my mayoral campaign, not only by publicly withdrawing his support, but by he easily shut off $40,000, $50,000 from people who were otherwise supportive of the campaign. And not for nothing, he was doing the same thing this time around, because I, had support from people that knew us both, and they almost all got captured by space aliens and never to be heard from again. So apparently my great sin is in, as a sitting elected official, meeting with somebody running for office and answering questions they had about things I had proposed publicly while in office. So people like Tammy Simmons, when they say that I was feeding Baines information while working for the mayor, I mean, from a timeline perspective, that can't have happened, because I wasn't working for Mayor Wieczorek at the time that he was running against Bob Baines. The mayor's people didn't want me anywhere near that campaign, so I had zero role to play, except for one meeting I had with the campaign brain trust after the primary, where they asked me what I thought about the primary and what they should do moving forward. And I laid out my thoughts for them. And unfortunately, really, they didn't pay much attention, because everything I warned against them doing, they did. And everything I told them to expect if they did it happened. Like, gee, you're turning the guy into the second coming of the Antichrist. You might want to be careful about that. Because if I were Bob Baines, I would take full-page ads out reprinting the letter of recommendation that Ray Wieczorek wrote for me when I was looking to be a superintendent. I'll never forget. They asked, "Well, how do you know that letter exists?" I said, "I wrote it, so I know it exists." Well, they kept demonizing the guy, and what did he do? He took out half-page ads reprinting the letter. I mean, what would you do? Anyway, so essentially, Ray and I have not spoken in 20 years, sad to say though it is, because he is somehow of the belief that I, his aide, his former aide, his very loyal aide, who got sent to places that angels would fear to tread to deliver messages that he did not want to deliver to people who are unhappy with him, I somehow became the fall guy for his loss to Bob Baines, which, to be perfectly honest with you, had more to do with them running simply an awful campaign than anything. So I wasn't on the inside of the campaign. I had no idea what they were going to do. I was not part of the day-to-day. I was not an employee of Ray Wieczorek at the time. They didn't even want my endorsement, which I offered. The difficult time that we had when I was on the board and he was the mayor, they wanted nothing to do with me. Okay, fine. But that doesn't mean I went over the wall and did anything to help Bob Baines. But apparently having a meeting with somebody and answering their questions about my proposals is, I guess, makes me a traitor and the reason why he lost. And he firmly believes that. And unfortunately, 20 years later, we're still paying that price for something that only exists in his mind. And he never asked the question, qui bono, who benefits, right? Who benefited by floating that story? Was it me, or was it the Baines campaign that at the time was a little worried about, what I was doing as a candidate? Ricky, you're on the air. Thanks for calling in.
Big fan fan of the show. I don't want to step on the last caller's questions, but I saw we're kind of running out of time in the in the show. I just wanted to kind of just say a couple things. I'm disappointed at the voters of Manchester for not getting you into the next round for the mayor. I think the mayor is doing not a very good job at all. I go downtown once a week or once every couple of weeks, in the small sample size that I get of that 5-minute walk to where I'm going, 2-minute walk to where I'm going, right near the Mexican restaurant and where you do your taping for the shows.
Yep.
It's awful. It's awful. That's just a 5-minute sample size that I see.
Yep.
I stand there and I see, oh, there was a shooting. I can see a place that there was a shooting down the road there. Yep. And I turn around and I say, there was a shooting over there. Mm-hmm. And it's just not a great situation at all. And this is my hometown, and I'm really embarrassed of what I see. And I don't know if you're banging your head against the wall trying to straighten things out here, but boy.
Well, unless
it wouldn't be something that me and my wife would say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's go out for dinner tonight. Oh, why don't we go down where there's those shootings? We're in Manchester. Have a delicious meal out on the curb. It just doesn't happen. So I appreciate the show, and I just want to say, but boy, I hope you can really. I know you're a big proponent of Manchester, and just want to tell you what I've been seeing recently downtown.
Well, Ricky, thank you very much.
I enjoy the show, and thank you very much for listening.
All right. And I appreciate the call, Ricky. And yeah, I mean, I heard about that all over the city. It's so sad, the number of people who told me that they don't feel comfortable either coming into the city from outside or if they live in the city about going downtown. It's, the issue set is definitely not working in Joyce Craig's favor. And, getting back to the Ray Wieczorek thing. So Ray Wieczorek didn't endorse Victoria Sullivan because he actually thinks she'd be a better mayor than I would be. I think if a gun were put to his head and he were made to ask the question or answer the question, he'd say that. He did it out of spite, and he did it to strike back at me because of his perception that I somehow betrayed him when he ran against Bob Baines. And it does. It bothers me. Anytime I think about it, because it's fundamentally not true, and I just don't have words for it, and it's sad. It really is. She got her PR mileage out of it. They were able to turn it into a crap storm on social media. Whatever information Ray may have told them about what happened, it's funny. I spoke to someone who asked me about it. They spoke to Ray. And they said that Ray and I gave the exact same story. And his answer was, Ray, it's time to get over it. And the thing he needs to get over is his own perception, because I did nothing to help Bob Baines beat Ray Wieczorek. I did whatever it is I could to help Ray Wieczorek hold on to that office, but I was limited in what I could do because they didn't want me to do anything. Okay, that's fine. I didn't take that personally. Didn't understand it, but it is what it is. So that endorsement of Ray Wieczorek, of Victoria Sullivan by Ray Wieczorek, was out of personal spite, not out of any belief or sense that she would somehow be a better mayor than I would be. At the end of the day, he knows what I did for him. He knows what my capabilities are. And I think he knows I would have been the right guy for the job at this point in time, given what the city needs and the fact that, let's be honest, I'm not always diplomatic. I am most always direct. I call it like I see it. I do what I say I'm going to do, and I say what I mean. And I'm a credible threat to make the changes that need to be made. I know the people, I know the players. As I've often said, I know where the bodies are buried, and I'm happy to dig them up and show them to everybody. Victoria has none of that. She has no functional knowledge of City Hall, the people, the politics. Sure, she knows who to call if she's organizing a neighborhood cleanup, but that doesn't mean she understands the people, the process, the politics, or how it works. And my opinion right now is Manchester can't afford a learning curve. Now, that's not my saying Joyce Craig should be reelected. There is an outside chance that the recount will change the result. But I do kind of want to not take issue with something that Ricky said. I just simply think I did not get to enough people. In a race like this, where it's that close, there are a ton of if-onlys. And the way I look at it is, there were so many if-onlys that if only one of them had changed, it would have been an entirely different ballgame. But one of them didn't change. And I, boil that down to God's will, to be perfectly honest with you. We don't always like the answers we get when we pray, but we always get answers when we do, right? We'll find out how final that answer is after tomorrow's recount. But, yeah. So that's the deal. If I seemed a little rambling in my answer to Barbara's question, it's just nothing I had planned. But, and a lot of people have asked, and I've debated saying something publicly about it or putting something on my blog to try to explain it. But it is, what is this? It is, it is what it is. So ultimately, a meeting where I answered questions about my own budget proposals and consolidations with a guy running for mayor, I guess is the scarlet letter of politics that I will wear as long as he's alive. I can deal with that. I think it's sad for the city, though, because I think, once again, it's a wonderful, awful example of how personal feelings, petty politics, personalities have driven this city in a bad direction. People don't think of the bigger picture. People don't think of the broader picture. They're more interested in settling their personal scores or reprising their petty paybacks than they are thinking the overall well-being of the city. So I really hate to sort of get into that kind of stuff, to be perfectly honest with you. I've been silent about it over all of these years because at the end of the day, I do respect the work that Ray Wieczorek did as mayor. I was proud, and I remain proud and honored to have been part of that for the nearly 6 years that I was. And, he will go down as a consequential mayor. And as with any mayor, there are pluses, the Civic Center, the revitalization of downtown, the changes of zoning, Manchester Neighbor Works, the airport expansion, a lot of great things. Some pretty bad things, too. The whole immigration refugee thing, the Yager-Decker study, $29 million fell from the sky, during that election, as a matter of fact, and that didn't help him, right? That's when the state started sending out millions of dollars in education aid, and Manchester got $29 million. Could have had like an $8.25 cut in the taxes, but Ray dropped it all into the operating expenses, all but enough to lower the tax rate by $1.49, which was a big bone of contention between him and I, public bone of contention when I was an alderman and he was the mayor, and he brought that forward. I think that had more to do with him losing than anything else, because taxpayers who had long been promised relief in this city saw an opportunity for a major tax cut, and they got $1.49 out of it. And as I said at the paper at the time, this isn't the meaningful tax relief that people were looking for. And it's kind of funny because Bob Baines turned around and said, well, gee, if I had known that all I had to do was run for mayor to get Ray Wieczorek to spend money on the schools, I would have done it a long time ago. It just didn't look right. It didn't work right. It was one of the many dumb things, frankly, he did over that last year, or his campaign did, that just, the worst wounds are the self-inflicted ones. And, I would have been okay not having aired any of this publicly, thinking about the greater good and not wanting to appear to be involved in some personality squabble. But Barbara asked, and I've been known to answer. So there it is. I am your ever humble host, Rich Girard. Thanks for tuning in. Until next week, be good, be well. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Don't do anything. Be good. Proud to have in the audience. Thanks for being there. Good night.
Hey, Rich, Al here. When you get a chance,